This weekend, Marvel released Black Panther Wakanda Forever, the final film of Phase 4 and the 30th film in the MCU. So now it's time to rank all 30 films in the MCU, not TV shows, just the films, from the worst to the best. Coming in at last place is Eternals. I will acknowledge the film itself looks gorgeous, it's got great cinematography, but the story and most of the characters are boring and the film is melodramatic. It tries to have all these ideas about divine intervention and letting bad things happen, but it all comes off as very pretentious. The film, for some reason, is also told out of order, where we jump ahead to characters' deaths, but then we later see that character again. I acknowledge the ambition, but the execution is incredibly dull. Number 29, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Out of all the films I've reviewed this year, this is probably my most controversial opinion. This one, and the fact that I also didn't like Turning Red. For me, I found this film occultishly dark, graphically violent, and overly long. When I go to an MCU movie, I'm expecting a fair bit of lightheartedness, but the majority of the film is just darkly occult, and this is coming from somebody who enjoys Harry Potter, but I just left the movie with a very dark feeling. It felt violent for shock value and the sake of being violent, as opposed to being done tastefully. Number 28, The Incredible Hulk. Even though this movie finally ties back into the MCU because of She-Hulk and no longer seems inconsequential like I've said in the past in other rankings, it's still not a good movie. It's slow and boring and on its own feels very out of place. The plot isn't that compelling, it's dull. Apart from a few scenes that feel like a monster movie, the film is a slog. Number 27, Thor the Dark World. The movie's biggest problems are the first 20 minutes are a lot of exposition given to the audience at once, and the villain is boring. Really, the only reason to even watch this movie is for the scenes with Loki and the death of a certain character that ties later into Avengers Endgame, but for the most part, this is one you can still justify skipping. Number 26, Captain Marvel. Much like the Star Wars Solo movie or the Amazon Rings of Power show, this movie gives us answers to questions nobody was asking. However, the difference between this film and Solo and Rings of Power is that those are enjoyable. For this film, it's hard to care about Carol Danvers' character because she is already overpowered from the first scene, and it doesn't really feel like she grows or changes throughout the film. The film also feels like they just wanted to make another Guardians of the Galaxy film, but without anything about Guardians of the Galaxy that made those films fun. We need a quirky alien animal sidekick, so let's have an alien cat. We need retro music and references, so let's set it in the 90s. We need space battles. Given where the MCU was at this point in time, it feels more like a Phase 1 movie, not a Phase 3 movie. It feels like a step back. Number 25, Black Panther Wakanda Forever. I appreciate the way the film pays tribute to the late Chadwick Boseman and deals with themes of grief. Out of the Phase 4 movies, this feels the most human. It feels the most personal. But when the film isn't honoring Chadwick Boseman, it gives us too many plot lines. Besides the main plot line about Shuri dealing with the loss of her brother, there's also the plot line about Riri Williams, who, much like America Chavez in Multiverse of Madness, doesn't feel like a character, but rather a plot device. Her last name might as well be MacGuffin. And by having her build an iron suit, it kind of negates Tony's sacrifice. What made Tony special was that he didn't have powers, but he was a tech genius, and he was such a tech genius that he's the only one able to build these suits. When anybody else tries to build them, they're just crude versions. Obadiah Stane in the first Iron Man film just takes the leftover scraps from the suit Tony built to escape captivity and doesn't really know how to use it. When Justin Hammer tries it in Iron Man 2, the test pilots all get seriously injured, and again, they're just cheaper knockoffs of Tony's. Spider-Man's suit that he builds himself aren't fancy, they're just a hoodie and goggles. All this fancier tech comes from Tony later. And sure, in Far From Home he builds himself a tech suit, but he does so with Tony's technology, and after having been mentored by Tony for a few years. So much so that Tony leaves Peter in AI so he can continue his legacy. So really, Tony's the only one who can build these things. But now the film expects us to buy into the idea that a teenage girl, who as far as we know has never met Tony Stark in her life, can build her own iron suit. Making a machine to detect vibranium, that I can buy into, but having her being able to build a fully fledged iron suit is where it doesn't make any sense. I get that she's smarter than average, but if anybody can build these things now, you take away what made Tony Stark unique. To quote Singer from The Incredibles, when everybody's super, nobody is. And then there's the thin plot line about Martin Freeman's character that I just didn't care about. And because the film is so somber and dealing with some very serious themes, when there's humor, it feels unnatural, awkward, and inappropriately timed. The film has a lot of emotion, but it's overstuffed. Speaking of another MCU film that's overstuffed, number 24, Iron Man 2. Another example of a film that had potential, but was ultimately bogged down by its own ambition and too many plot lines. This feels like less of a story focusing on Tony and more of a setup for the first Avengers film. It seems like for every good idea they had, they also counteracted it with a bad idea. Whiplash is a great villain, but then you have Justin Hammer, who's over the top, goofy, cartoonish, and has incredibly stupid motivations. You have an interesting storyline about Tony's arc reactor poisoning him, but then the film has scenes like Tony at a party peeing in his suit and then fighting War Machine while drunk. It's like Marvel was so insecure about whether a sequel to Iron Man, which was already a huge gamble, would work, they basically said yes to every idea pitched. Number 23, Thor. A film that I'm kind of mixed on and don't have that much to say about because I'm never really that invested in it. Kenneth Branagh brings his own unique style to the film, and there are some fun moments of Thor getting some culture shock with Earth customs, but there's nothing particularly ambitious about this film. It just feels like a typical comic book movie without anything about it that stands out apart from the cinematography. Number 22, Iron Man 3. It's a problem when the best part about the movie is not the main character. The best parts about it are the scenes with Harley and the scenes with Trevor Slattery. Now, I know a lot of people aren't a fan of the Mandarin twist, but given the events of Shang-Chi, I think it makes sense. Even before Shang-Chi came out, I've always somewhat defended the twist. Captain America the Winter Soldier sets up the idea about evil people being implanted as the true villains, while they use other people as pawns to take the fall. Personally, I think if they had released Winter Soldier first, it probably would have been better received. Number 21, Black Panther. The film has a lot of great action and at times comes off like a spy film. Chadwick Boseman's charisma really makes this film work, but on a story level, I think it has a lot of problems. The way a Wakandan society works doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. They don't choose their leaders based on their beliefs. They choose them based on who's the most brutal in combat. They're also so distrustful of each other that at the beginning of the film, when they send spies from Wakanda, they also send other spies to spy on their own spies. And at the end of the film, the people of Wakanda decide they're going to open the border to show the rest of the world a better way of living because we have technology. But even though they just had a war among their own people, and there's also that one other tribe that they just abandoned to live in the mountains and cut off contact with until it was convenient for them. Even though the action scenes are really fun, the film can have a lot of style at times, on a story level, it doesn't work that much for me. Number 20, Doctor Strange. An MCU entry that, for me, is enjoyable enough. The film does come off as a bit pretentious with its ideas about life, death, and other philosophical discussions that make it seem like it's trying to be like The Matrix. And that combined with the visuals that, while they are cool, are very reminiscent to films like Inception. The film does give the main character a great arc, which is why the other appearances of Doctor Strange, especially in Multiverse of Madness, where they essentially made him a bad guy at the end of the film, are so frustrating. On its own, it works, as long as you ignore who Doctor Strange is in the other films. Number 19, Thor Love and Thunder. I get the criticisms with this film. If it was too goofy for you, okay. But for me, it worked enough. The film succeeded in one aspect where the first two Thor films didn't. I actually cared about the relationship between Thor and Jane. Now, I do think Christian Bale was a cool villain, but they did kind of waste him. I enjoyed it when I saw it, but I'm not really clamoring to watch it again. Number 18, Thor Ragnarok. After one film that was kind of middle of the road and a follow-up that was just awful, Taika Waititi finally brings us a Thor film that gets it right. The first two films had almost no sense of fun, and this film is really fun. But it does try a little bit too hard to be Guardians of the Galaxy, and I do think the Grandmaster as a villain didn't work. I think we probably should have spent more time with Hela, because I think she was a much stronger villain. Number 17, Guardians of the Galaxy 2. The biggest problem with this movie for me is that it has jokes at places where there don't need to be jokes. Like Wakanda Forever, there are scenes in this that are meant to help the audience connect with the characters. But instead of pausing to let those moments sit, they immediately follow it up with a joke. And what's also frustrating is the events that get the Guardians to meet Ego are very contrived. They happen to land there because they get shot down because Rocket stole batteries. Okay. I do enjoy the character arc Star-Lord goes through, but some of the jokes needed to be cut, and the first act could have been less contrived. Number 16, Avengers Age of Ultron. Much like how Iron Man 2 was the filler chapter to prep for the first Avengers movie, this is the filler chapter to prep for Captain America Civil War. The cast, much like the first film, do still work well off each other. I like the running joke about Cap telling people to watch their language, for example. And even newcomers Elizabeth Olsen and Aaron Taylor-Johnson give performances that feel like they've been there since the beginning of the franchise. They don't feel awkward because they're the new kids to this franchise. James Spader gives one of my favorite villain performances in the MCU as Ultron. Say what you will about how they wrote him as a character, but his voice performance is chilling. The film does meander a bit in the second act, again, mostly to set up Civil War, and the romance between Bruce and Natasha comes out of nowhere and also goes nowhere after this film. It's not as high stakes or ambitious as the first Avengers film, but I still find it kind of entertaining. Number 15, Iron Man. A film that, given its ingredients, was a huge gamble. Films like X-Men The Last Stand, Fantastic Four, Superman Returns, and Spider-Man 3 were not very well received by critics or audiences, causing many to believe that apart from Christopher Nolan's Batman films, only the first of which had been released at the time, the comic book film genre was more or less dead. Then out of nowhere, a newly formed studio called Marvel Studios announced they were making a film about Iron Man, a character that outside of a niche comic book community, nobody had really heard of. Sure, Iron Man had a cartoon in the 90s, but it wasn't as successful as the other comic book cartoons running at the time, such as X-Men or Batman. It only lasted for 26 episodes. On top of that, they announced the character would be played by Robert Downey Jr., who at the time was an actor nobody wanted to work with due to his substance abuse problems. And on top of that, Jon Favreau was announced as the director. Favreau had directed films before, but his only successful ones were Elf and Zathura, and even then, those were family films, not big blockbusters. By all accounts, this should not have worked, yet it somehow had all the right ingredients to pull it off. Robert Downey Jr.'s charisma and comedic timing really helped the film, as well as its big, exciting action sequences. While other comic book movies of the time were a bit sillier and more cartoonish, this one felt like it was taking itself seriously. Even though I personally don't like Iron Man as a character, I have to acknowledge it is a very well-made film. This is one of the only films that still holds up from Phase 1, the other two for me being Captain America and The Avengers. Number 14, Guardians of the Galaxy. Another film that when the trailer came out, most people thought wasn't going to work. The trailer didn't really show off any of the humor, so the whole idea of having a movie where two of the characters are a raccoon and a tree seemed bananas. But much like Iron Man, it had just the right cast and the right story with well-written characters. The film serves as a redemption story with a very likable group of cast members who all work very well off each other. It's bizarre, it's out there, but it really works. Number 13, Ant-Man. Yet another film a lot of people did not have confidence in. I'm seeing a pattern here. Considering this was originally supposed to be a Phase 1 movie, but they couldn't agree on a script or director, so the film just kind of sat, that was kind of a bad sign. But I think this is one of those rare times where a film sitting in development for years actually worked to its advantage. There's a good chance that had it come out when it was supposed to as a Phase 1 film, we may not have gotten Paul Rudd as a star, and I can't really imagine anyone else playing Scott Lang. Now, plot-wise, at least in terms of the villain, it is a little reminiscent of the first Iron Man film, but what gives it its own flavor is it's also a heist film, and the main character is someone who hasn't made the best decisions in life, and you want to see him turn his life around and succeed. The other films of Phase 2 were political thrillers or big spectacle sci-fi films. This is a film that feels more human and goes back to the simplicity of Phase 1. It's not my favorite film of Phase 2, but it's pretty close. Number 12, Ant-Man and the Wasp. A film that's even funnier than the first. It takes everything that worked about the first one and expands it. The story is slightly better than the first one because it feels like it's had its own unique flavors to be like Iron Man. Scott and Hope are a great duo in this one, and we also get more of the Wombats, who are one of the best parts of the film, and where they take their story in the film is pretty fun. Number 11, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This is one of the most fun films in the MCU. The action is extremely well choreographed and very fun to watch. The world building and mythology are incredibly interesting, and it somewhat fixes the controversial Mandarin twist from Iron Man 3. But like I said, I've never really had a problem with it. What pushes it back a smidge is Awkwafina. She's very annoying and unfunny. The main character is so charming that to have her be the comic relief and just have her be annoying and loud really brings it down. And she's one of the most awkward parts of the film. Awkward Fina. Number 10, Black Widow. This, in my opinion, is how Brad Bird should have done Incredibles 2. Incredibles 2 is disappointing for me because instead of expanding on the idea from the first film and having a movie about a crime-fighting family, it instead became essentially an Elastigirl movie with a long Jack short thrown in as filler to an already thin movie. This is what I was hoping Incredibles 2 was going to be. Even though Brad Bird was not involved in this film, it still feels like a lot of influence was taken from him, because this film is like a combination of the first Incredibles movie and Brad Bird's Mission Impossible movie. The actors all have a very strong dynamic. The villain is one of the most despicable, non-superpowered MCU villains, right up there for me with Robert Redford's character from Winter Soldier. The action is well choreographed, the plot is intriguing, and even when the film slows down, the dialogue is also compelling and keeps you invested. I think it was worth the 11-year wait. Number 9, Spider-Man Far From Home. I like this film a lot more than when I first saw it, but upon rewatching it, it's slightly deteriorated in quality for me. That's not to say I don't like it. I mean, it's in the top 10 on a list of 30 movies. It's just that I see a lot more issues with it now than when I first saw it. The film's biggest problem is that the movie is essentially Spider-Man cleaning up Tony's messes, even posthumously, so he's not really given a chance to be his own character until almost the end of the film. I think Jake Gyllenhaal was well cast as Mysterio, but his motivations, just like half the villains in the MCU, are hatred for Tony Stark. Peter doesn't even get his own villain to fight, he gets Iron Man's leftovers. A lot of the humor in the film also feels needlessly crass, considering Spider-Man is still a teenager in this film, so a lot of the raunchier jokes come off as really ewy. And I also don't think Zendaya has any chemistry with Peter, so to have a big part of the film revolve around Peter trying to confess his love for her just doesn't work for me, since I don't care about them as a couple. It's still a fun movie, but it's held back by its need to not let Tony Stark go. Number 8, Spider-Man Homecoming. Spider-Man's first standalone entry in the MCU is a very fun one. The film feels like a teen comedy from the 80s, mostly Ferris Bueller, but with superhero elements thrown in. Tom Holland plays the unconfident, fresh to the superhero scene Spider-Man really well, but again, the film is held back by its constant need to throw Iron Man in instead of just letting it be a solo Spider-Man film. Though, apart from the first 2 Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, this does feel for the most part like the original source material. Number 7, Captain America, the First Avenger. Up to this point in the MCU, we've had main characters who are genius scientists or gods. The main character in this one is neither of those things. He's just an ordinary guy who is trying his best to do the right thing despite the challenges he was born into, and even after getting his powers, he doesn't let it go to his head, as is so often the case with these stories. He remains true to who he was before the serum. He doesn't fight for fame or glory or wealth. He fights because he wants to defend the country and people he loves. Setting the film in World War II makes it stand out from the rest of the films in the MCU, as none of the other films really have the same style. It's got great action, a great script, and my favorite main character in the MCU. Number 6, Captain America Civil War. This has one of my favorite fight sequences in the MCU with the airport battle. It's the cinematic equivalent of taking all your action figures and smashing them into each other. The film is very well paced, and despite Cap's name being in the title, it doesn't show just his side of the conflict. It presents Iron Man's point of view as well, and lets the audience choose who they want to side with. I'm Team Cap. And the film is also the introduction of Black Panther and Spider-Man. Black Panther is really mysterious and cool, and of course, including Spider-Man after several years of rights negotiations with Sony, blew our minds. There are 2 things about this film that I don't care for, though. The first being the issue of trying to make Cap and Sharon a couple. The way they end Cap's story in Endgame, where he goes back to live with Peggy, now means that in that scene, he's kissing his niece. And even before we knew that, he's only met her 1 movie ago, and knew so little about her, they didn't even know Sharon was related to Peggy until Peggy's funeral when he tells everybody. So either way, it's incredibly weird. The Russo brothers need to pull a George Lucas and make an edit where he's not kissing her. They also wrote Endgame, so let that be a lesson in going back and reading what you've previously written to make sure it makes sense. The other issue is Spider-Man's intro scene. Aunt May just lets Tony Stark, this adult stranger that she doesn't know, be alone with her teenage nephew, where Stark then proceeds to lock the door and tell Peter to lie to May about where he's going with him without her supervision and what he's doing with him. She's not a responsible guardian. An almost perfect film, but it falls a bit short because of those issues. Number 5, Captain America, the Winter Soldier. This movie is actually perfect. Even honest trailers couldn't make fun of it. It's also arguably the most accessible MCU movie, as it doesn't feel like a comic book movie at all. It's more of a Tom Clancy-esque political thriller. The action is well done, the story's intriguing, Cap and Black Widow have great chemistry, which makes me mad they didn't end up together. The villain is one of the best non-superpowered villains in the MCU with a despicable plan. This is one of my favorite non-Avengers MCU films. Number 4, The Avengers. Well, I mean, now it's not quite as ambitious as the other Avengers films, because we have come such a long way since this film came out. It's still really good. Even though story-wise it's a little bit smaller scale by these standards, and Maybe the villains are kind of generic. The cast and writing are what carry the film. The cast is very entertaining with their quick back and forth with each other. The panorama shots in this film that show all of them are well directed by the cinematographer, and it's still a fun ride even all these years later. Number 3, Avengers Endgame. An almost perfect finale to over 20 films of build-up. There's really only one issue I have with the film. It's, like I said before, they have Captain America go back to live with Peggy instead of having him choose Black Widow. Because even before Black Widow dies, there's nice little scenes of them just talking, and they still do have good chemistry. Thor also gets a bit of closure to some of the more traumatic events in his life, which is nice. This is almost everything I'd want from a film of this nature. It works really well, even if it's not quite perfect. Number 2, Avengers Infinity War. For a film with such a big cast and 20 films of build-up, there was a huge risk of it being overstuffed. But, miraculously, it works. All the actors keep up with each other incredibly well. The film has one of the darkest openings and endings of the MCU, and Thanos is one of the greatest villains in cinematic history, in my opinion, up there with the likes of Darth Vader. They make him complex, and though you don't agree with what he's doing, you understand why. It's got big spectacle, a compelling story, and one of the best twist endings of cinema history. And coming in at number 1 is Spider-Man No Way Home. Now, some of you are probably thinking, oh, Josh, you're just blinded by nostalgia. You only like the film because of its novelty. And, well, to some degree that is true. Nostalgia aside, the film works because of its characters and their arcs and how they're resolved. Tobey's Spider-Man, for example, gets to be the cool older mentor to the other two Spider-Mans. Andrew Garfield's Spidey finally gets closure over Gwen Stacy's death in his films. And by the end of the film, Tom Holland's Spidey has grown as a character the most than he has in his other films. The other two films Holland was in, he was thought of as a successor to Stark. But at the end of this film, he's his own man, he finally gets a fresh reset, he gets a chance to be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man he's always wanted to be, he's learned how to control his anger and grief, and how to be responsible with his powers. For some, this may be nothing more than a novelty film, but for me, I think it brings the best closure to a character in the MCU. So it comes in at number 1. Go ahead and share your ranking of all 30 MCU films. You can include the shows too if you want. I just chose not to. And I will see you next time.